Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and today my guest is Father Dwight Longenecker, author of Mystery of the Magi, The Quest to Identify the Three Wise Men. Father, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
What an interesting topic. Of course, here we are on the 12th of December, 13 days from Christmas, and we're going to talk about the story of the mystery of the Magi. Now, I was raised in a Jewish home, and so as far as I was concerned, they were the wise men's, a good Jewish name.
Yeah.
You know, Saul, Bernie, and Phil Wiseman, and really didn't have a lot of significance. When I became a believer at age 44, I understood gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Myrrh being an ointment that was used for the healing of a circumcision. These are things I knew from my Jewish upbringing that I just applied and said, okay, well, this makes sense. You bring gold to the king. Frankincense has many purities and powers, and myrrh is a very specific ointment that is applied for the healing of a circumcision. So I never once, I'll be 66 in a couple of weeks, I never once gave a second thought to the story of it. Recently, I was asked about the kings from the East, and they must have come from the Far East, but the East is never referred to in the Bible as China. It's always referred to as that area of Iraq. And so then all of a sudden your book comes and say, you know what? I guess I am confused. I guess I really don't know anything about other than we three kings of Orient are, but it wasn't the Orient. And this notion...
It's kind of like we three kings of Orient aren't.
Exactly. And so I got this phone call saying, how would you like to have this amazing priest on to talk about the mystery of the Magi? And I thought to myself, all right, yeah, since I never heard the story wrong, maybe I'll hear the story for the first time right. Of course, I've seen the plays. They all have the same depiction, but they don't have any real material meaning to me, even as a New Testament Jesus believer. So I'm looking to you as being someone to shed light on this mystery, because I think there's a lot of people that don't view it the way you view it and can't substantiate it the way you do. So first, let me introduce the audience to you. You're a pastor, award-winning blogger and freelance writer, a graduate of Oxford University. You've written 16 books on different aspects of religion. You enjoy theater, Benedictine monasteries, and speaking to groups about the wise men. He's married to Allison, and they have 4 children. Visit Dwight's blog, browse his books, and be in touch with him at www.dwightlongenecker, L-O-N-G-E, Necker, N-E-C-K-E-R.com. So you are a pastor, but of a particular order. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm a Catholic priest.
Okay, you're a Catholic priest, but you're married.
Yes.
Okay,
and the way that, just to illuminate that, I'm a former Anglican priest, and there is a little provision in the Catholic Church for those of us who convert to the Catholic Church from Anglicanism and maybe Lutheranism, that sometimes an exception can be made about celibacy, which allows us to be ordained as Catholic priests, even though we have wives and kids.
Interesting. That brings up a whole another subject.
That's a subject for another talk, maybe.
Yeah, that's what we would call an equine of a different hue.
Yeah.
All right. Wonderful. So you are a practicing Catholic priest, and tell me what is the Hallmark TV? Because I guess that's where most theology comes from when it comes to the Christmas story. Comes from Hallmark television or TBN or Christian television.
Well, one of the reasons I wrote this book about the three wise men, well, we should just say the wise men, because first of all, Matthew never says there were three. But the reason I wrote about the wise men is because I think in our general society, an awful lot of people have a great big basket they call the Christmas basket. And into that basket goes a lot of fairy tale stories, talking snowmen, flying reindeer, elves who come down come down the chimney, flying, you know, fairies and twinkle lights, and then there's the shepherds who hear angels singing, and these mystical wizards who follow a magical star, and they put all those stories together into this big magical Christmas story bag, and in fact, I wanted to say, hang on, these stories are presented as historical, that they really happened. So what do we make of the magical elements? What do we make of these sort of things that sound like fairy tales? And so when I did the research and found that there's a very sound historical basis for the story of the wise men, especially as it links in with the Gospel of Matthew. Over the years and centuries, though, the simple story in Matthew has been elaborated and embellished with legend and layers of myth and tradition. And so I trimmed all that back just to look at the history.
Okay, and in the history, I guess this is one of those cases where we have to tell what people believe, what the common belief structure is, and then peel it back factually so that we can come down to the bare truth.
Yes, and the thing which complicates it is that a lot of the traditions and the legends also have a theological dimension. In other words, some of the things were put in to give a preaching point, if you like. So you mentioned the three gifts: gold representing Christ's kingship, incense representing his divinity, and myrrh representing his tragic death. Well, those aren't in Matthew's story. Those were preaching points which a later theologian imposed on the story, and it then became part of the tradition. So these extra traditions came in. There's nothing wrong with them, but it's good to trim them back and realize what is tradition and what is actually fact.
Okay, so you start out by really what are the three biggest myths surrounding the Magi and their journey?
I think in most people's imagination, the Magi are mystical wizards from the East, maybe Persia, China, or India, and they made a long trek across the desert on camels, following a miraculous star that led them step by step through the night sky. Well, again, that's all part of the story and the legend we accept, but Matthew doesn't say there were three. He doesn't say they were kings. He doesn't say they went on camels, and he doesn't say they went on a very long trek. All of that has been accumulated over the years into this beautiful story, but it's not there in the Bible.
Okay. So if the myth of, we'll call it the myth of the Magi, the mystery of the Magi, then who were they?
Well, you have to read the book, won't you?
Yes.
But my theory is that they were actually sages, wise men who were also diplomats and courtiers at the court of King Aretas IV of Nabatea. The Nabatean civilization was the kingdom just to the east of Jerusalem, Judea, in dominating the Arabian Peninsula. And I put all the facts together: geographical, economic, political, cultural, religious, to build up a very strong case that it's the wise men went on a comparatively short journey from Petra, which is now in Jordan, following their established trade routes to the court of Herod the Great in Jerusalem.
Which biblically supports throughout the Old Testament that the East is never referred to as the Orient. That is a modern interpretation and application that...
Yeah, we took particular clues from Matthew's gospel, and we explored the depth of them and didn't take them for granted. So when we begin to look at, Matthew says simply, wise men came from the East. Now, it's very interesting how the understanding of this developed. When after the Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans, the center of Christianity moved north to Syria, then Asia Minor, and west to Greece and Rome. Now, if you're a Christian in the second part of the first century and beyond, and you're living in Asia Minor, Greece, or Rome, and you read Matthew says wise men came from the East, you assume that that's Persia, present-day Iraq and Iran. But Matthew wrote his gospel to the Christians in Judea and Jerusalem much earlier than that. And if he wrote it to a Jewish audience as well. And for the Jewish audience in Judea, the East was always Arabia.
Correct.
And in the Old Testament, the East is always Arabia. Persia and Babylon are referred to as the North, because to get there, you have to go north and then east. And so when we look at depth at that, it seems that Matthew is using the term the East as a kind of shorthand for Arabia, the way when we say the South, we mean Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and so forth.
Okay. So at the highest possible level, other than it being referred to in Scripture, what is the significance of the recognition of bearers of gifts?
Well, over the years, of course, Christian preachers have mined this rather short story in Matthew for lots and lots of beautiful meaning. And when we celebrate Epiphany, for instance, which is the feast of the wise men coming to the Christ child, we celebrate the coming of the light to the non-Jewish peoples. And this is still a valid interpretation of the story, and it's probably the reason Matthew put the story in his gospel, because you'll remember that in the early church, there was a big controversy between the Jewish Christians. Is Jesus only for the Jews, or is he for the Gentiles as well? And so Matthew, by putting this story right up front in his gospel, is making the clear point to his Jewish audience that Jesus is for the Gentiles too. And that's the point we still take from the story. And curiously, if the Magi came from Arabia, which I contend that they do in my book, then the Nabatean civilization makes that same point very, very well, because they were a trading nation with trade routes which extended to Yemen in the east, and then across the Indian Ocean to India and China, down East Africa, and all the way up to Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. Therefore, they were a kind of melting pot nation, and they had influences, cultural, religious, economic influences from all those areas of the world. And so they're the perfect representatives of all of the Gentile world coming to Jesus.
Very interesting. Now, are there archaeological finds? Are there historical evidentiary documents which frame this out to add to the validity of your mystery?
Yes, well, one of the reasons that there has not been a strong case made for the Nabateans being the Magi is because the Nabateans didn't actually leave a written history. The Greeks and the Romans and the Egyptians did. The Nabateans did not. So therefore, there's not a lot of textual evidence for their culture. They're a very mysterious civilization. Also, people didn't explore this because they assumed that the old story of the wise men come from the east, from Persia and India, was the right one. I showed how it's probably mistaken. But also there is archaeological evidence which has come up really only within the last 50 or 60 years. There are links to the Dead Sea Scrolls, to the Nabatean civilization, and the Isaiah prophecies, but also archaeologists have discovered that Nabatean temples are built as they're designed and aligned with the astrological signs and the equinox and so forth. So they had a very astral dimension to their religion. Furthermore, in the 1930s, in one of these temples, they found a stone carved zodiac, which indicated that the Nabateans had an astral dimension to their religion and that they were astrologers. So all of that comes together as some of the evidence to point towards them being the Magi.
I see. Uh, when people look at this and say, okay, Matthew recorded it, and of course we call Matthew his gospel is to the Jews. It's got more Old Testament references into it. How do we, and this really goes for 2,000 years of history, really from 325, Constantine, Helena, to present day, we've altered what the Word has said and turned it into not being Bibleology, but theology and doctrinology and practicum, and thus we wind up with a byproduct of 35,000 denominations of Christianity with no universal celebrations celebrated the same way. In Judaism, in the first 2,000 years, we developed traditions which are still in practice and have been in practice the same way, at the same time, in the same format for 4,000 years. Christianity has not wrapped itself around this, behold how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell together in unity, because there's difference all the way around, and if you don't agree with this, well, then you need to go leave and start another denomination of the non-Magi's, or of the Church of the Six Magi's, because they were twins, and they just don't talk about the other one because there's no need to mention it. How did we get so far adrift from taking a passage of Scripture and creating a dramatic representation of biblical and heavenly import and assigning so much significance to this?
Well, the development of the particular Magi story started as early as the early second century. In the second and third centuries, it was especially influenced by Gnostic writings. Gnostics were like the New Age believers of their time, and they loved this idea of a mystical king from the east who followed a magical star, and they just took that story and ran with it. Some of the documents from that time are totally fictional and fantastical stories, and these stories then influenced the tradition in the West. And through the Middle Ages, they continued to theologize and spin the legend out because, remember, people couldn't read then. And so they adopted the stories and they told the stories. And this particular story, more than any other in the New Testament, was elaborated and exaggerated over the years. And I just went back and trimmed that back and found what the Bible said. Now, I happen to be a former evangelical who became a Catholic. And so I have a great reverence and a great love of the Scriptures. But I also believe as a Catholic that the source of unity is actually the voice of the historic church, which is the Catholic Church, which does bring the unity that we all lament is missing in the Christian church. But therefore, I'm writing this and saying that here, let's look at the history and understand the history of the Magi story and be reminded that the gospel accounts are rooted in eyewitness accounts. They're rooted in genuine history of the time.
Well, it is fascinating because so much is made of it, and it has become almost mythical in its representation, and this clears up much of that. We're talking with Father Dwight Longenecker, author of Mystery of the Magi, The Quest to Identify the Three Wise Men. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to find out why Eric Metaxas says how utterly refreshing and encouraging to read Father Longenecker's extraordinary ruminations on something we all thought we understood and obviously hardly begin to understand until now. We'll be right back. Shalom. I'm the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, Executive Director of Igniting a Nation and host of the daily TV program Revealing the Truth, seen live every Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time at www.ianbn.com, and then replayed throughout the day and night via our website. All of our segments can be seen on the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel. Since our launch in January of this year, we've expanded our global reach to over 54 countries with a social media following of over 125,000. Our commitment is to bring you the most in-depth interviews with authors, subject matter experts, and thought leaders from around the world. We have interviewed guests from Israel, Brazil, England, India, and all across North America. All of our authors are featured on the Books and Media page on our website, www.ianbn.com. There you can find a direct link to the book you want to order, and we receive a small commission directly from Amazon. There is no cost to you for this service. In addition to our daily teachings and interviews, we make available to you the archive of all of the interviews on our YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram channels. Our live program is available from our homepage, and there is never a charge to you for any of this access. We made the decision long ago that we would remain a commercial-free resource that would not be influenced by any pressure from any outside company. There are only two ways that we are able to continue to operate this ministry and provide you with the only live 4-hour daily Christian television talk show program. The first is through your support and tax-deductible contributions to Igniting a Nation. These can be made directly through the donate button on the website or sent through the mail to Igniting a Nation, 2700 Corporate Drive, Suite 120, Birmingham, Alabama, 35242. The other way we support the program is by offering you a unique opportunity to have access to over 10 years worth of teachings on a subscription basis. The teaching archives contains all of my prior sermons, Torah studies, prophecy in the news videos, and much more for the low subscription price of $5 per month. This subscription grants you unlimited access to over 800 hours of content not available elsewhere, and is updated weekly with the most current prophecy classes. In addition to 20 hours of original TV programming each weekday, we invite you to join us live every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday evenings for our Prophecy in the News classes. The times and locations are listed on our events page on the website www.ianbn.com. Every day, you and I are faced with the challenge of where we will go to hear the truth. We are committed to bring you the only program of its kind that covers the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. We cannot do this without your support. Since we launched on January 5th, 2017, we have aired over 300 individual teachings, interviews, and commentaries not available anywhere else. We are now working side by side with almost every major Christian publishing house to bring you the most in-depth feature interviews possible. Our 1-hour features address every subject that affects the believer's life. We are hearing of salvations from the Middle East, Africa, and all across the United States. Lives are being changed every day, and we have only just begun. Our mission is to become your trusted resource and grant you access to the people, tools, and information you need to grow in your relationship with the Lord. You can help us by liking us on social media and through your financial support. We know you have many choices in who you support, but we are prayerfully asking you to consider helping us keep revealing the truth, true to our calling, to cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth like no other program available. Donate today and help us bring the message to the four corners of the earth. Visit www.ianbn.com and donate, buy a book, or subscribe to our teaching archives. Without you, we do not exist. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking with Father Dwight Longenecker, author of Mystery of the Magi, The Quest to Identify the Three Wise Men. Father Longenecker, welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation.
It's really quite a delightful topic because it's been festive and it's been, I even think as a Jewish kid in elementary school, I might have played one of the wise men. That was all, that was there's kind of an old joke that if you are a male cast in a Jewish part, you should not be given a speaking part because you're not going to have one at home. So, so the wise men didn't have speaking parts, so it only seemed natural to cast a young Jewish man because, he wasn't going to have a voice at home. Mm-hmm. This book is new. It's a new release. Why today? Why now? Here's a story that's been told for 1,800 years. Why now this fresh new look? What was the motivation? What was the heart of it? And what message are you looking for your audience to take away?
Well, it really is an interesting question because for many years, of course, most believers simply accepted the traditions that the wise men came from Persia or India or China, and so they didn't really look into it. They just accepted that. And then with the advent of New Testament scholarship in the 20th century, increasingly scholars began to dismiss the Magi story as being a pious fiction, which Christians invented to make Jesus more special. And so for both of those reasons, nobody actually asked the questions that I asked. The scholars didn't ask it because they considered the wise men to be fictional. So why would you go on a quest to identify the historical Peter Pan, And the believers just accepted the story as it was delivered to them without question. I went back and said, well, what if they're historical, but what if all those legends were not? And I went back to Matthew's gospel and found that the pieces of the historical puzzle fell into place, and that both the skeptical scholars and the sort of believers with blinders, if you can say it that way, both had got it wrong. And the other thing is that within the last 50 or 60 years, enormous discoveries have been made in the Middle East in terms of archaeology, forensics, new scientific advances, textual discoveries, and historical discoveries and scholarship and linguistic discoveries. And all of these have shed an enormous amount of light on the ancient Middle East. And so in many ways, it could only have been discovered now. And there were other theories over the past that the wise men came from Arabia, but nobody has put it all together the way I have. Indeed, when I was doing the research, I kept saying, why didn't anybody write this book yet? And that's the reason why. Certain things have come together to make it possible right now.
One of the things that you do so well in the book is you weave together the cultural and ethno-social celebrations around this time in first century Judaism. There is no first century Christianity at this point. It's all first century Judaism. Yes. So there are things within the Jewish context that must be addressed culturally. First of all, the recognition of Jesus being a king. He would not receive his crown until the appointed time.
Yes.
So this was very prophetic in this visitation of the revelation that they were coming to pay homage to a king.
Yes.
I'll share a secret with you, a very well unknown secret, and that's all the kings of the Bible were all crowned in the same month. Jesus was crowned in the same month that all the kings of the Bible were crowned. And it's very fascinating that it was done by 3 Roman centurions as a joke, but nevertheless fulfilled a rich tradition of every king being crowned at a certain time of the month, of a particular month. And it was that month and it was that day that the crowning of the king took place all the way through the Bible. Very little known fact, because why would it be important? Well, it would be important to a Jew struggling to find out if he really was. All right?
It's the more we dig into these facts, the more fascinating it is, and the more we realize the Gospels are very historical, and we're the ones who just didn't know enough. I came across one just yesterday about the shepherds on the hillside at Christmas. I don't know if you know this one, but this is intriguing. Scholars used to say, well, Jesus must have been born in the spring because sheep dropped their lambs in the spring, and the shepherds were spending all night in the fields to help the sheep when they were dropping their lambs. Um, it's recently been discovered that the sheep in the Middle East, the particular breed that those shepherds would have had, their gestation period is different, and they drop their lambs in December. And so, and so when you find out these cultural and historical details, you go back and say, well, it looks like the Gospels got it right, and we're the ones who got it wrong.
Well, you know, I have long been a proponent, and I write the same blog. I wrote a blog years ago, and I release it, that stop calling people pagans. Let's stop it. Let's stop calling Catholic tradition pagan. Let's stop calling celebration of having a tree in your home pagan. Jesus said, when two or more are gathered in my name, there I'll be in the midst of them.
Yes.
So if you're dyeing Easter eggs and you're dyeing them in the name of Jesus, it sounds to me like Scripture says he'll be there. You know, as a little boy, Jewish boy, I dyed Easter eggs. As a little Jewish boy, I sang Christmas carols. I grew up in the 50s, early 50s. So that was the way school was. That's what you did.
The Catholic understanding of a relationship between paganism and Christianity is that there are certain pagan elements which have carried over into the Christian faith, but that's because we have fulfilled those things and completed them. So, for instance, when you find that there is a pagan idea of, let's say, a divine king, well, yeah, all Christians say Jesus is our king and he's our God. Well, the idea of a divine king was a pagan idea, but we see it being fulfilled in Jesus. And so, if there was something in paganism which comes into Christianity, we have always taken the point of view that we have baptized that and we've seen it being fulfilled in Jesus in a similar way that we see the Jewish prophecies being fulfilled in Jesus.
Exactly. And I appreciate you putting it in that context, because there are things. You know, what's interesting is that God gave us this book of instructions of what to do. But he did not give us the book of instructions that go with it, the companion guide of the how to do. Here's what to do. Like, when you do this, or as often as you do this, okay, do this in remembrance of me. Now, did he say, as often as you pick up a plastic cup and take a cracker? Or did he say, as often as you celebrate the Passover meal? Or we have to, as the scholars, as the studiers, as leaders, fill in some of these blanks, and this becomes that applied aspect of a biblical adherent life. When we examine the integrity of the Gospels, the story of the Magi now becomes a bone of contention. It's celebrated in one area as a glorious story and makes for a great play, and it's 3 more kids get to be in the play and 3 more roles get to be filled than if you don't have them.
Right. Well, what I've done is I've compared this. You're absolutely right, and I've compared this to, let's say, the story of King Arthur. In England, you can find a hill fort that archaeologists reckon might be the site of Arthur's Camelot. And Arthur was probably a real historical figure who was a Celtic chieftain during the times of the Roman invasions. However, all of that archaeology and those historical facts are a far stretch from a Monty Python film, a Broadway musical called Camelot, and Disney's Sword in the Stone, and all the other umpteen TV shows and movies made about King Arthur. So, but we can enjoy all those movies and TVs and the legend and the myth, but we should also be able to switch gears in our brain and say, but let's look at the actual history and the facts and be able to examine it. Likewise, we can enjoy singing "We Three Kings of Orient Are," which is not historical at all, and have the children dress up as wise men and kings in the play. But we should also be able to share with them the actual facts and the history behind it.
So one of the essential parts of the story of the Magi is the Star of Bethlehem.
Yes.
You write in the book, in the popular Christmas story, the Star of Bethlehem is a miraculous celestial sign that moved through the night sky, guiding the wise men on an arduous journey through harsh desert lands to the humble birthplace of Jesus. Christmas cards and nativity plays perpetuate the myth of the magical star, but astronomers point out that stars are fixed points. They don't move across the sky from one place to another. Of course, it's not quite as simple as that. While stars are indeed fixed, they appear to move because of rotation. How do we address this star? And now there's a movie now, and there's a scientific.
The idea that the star was a magical star that moved through the sky and guided them, that first began in the 3rd century with Gnostic stories and myths about the wise men, fantastical fairy tales. And at one point, for instance, it was not a star, it was a radiant, burning baby that floated in the sky and spoke to them and did miracles as they went. You know, that sort of idea then drifted into our tradition. In fact, it doesn't say that in Matthew's gospel. It said the wise men said, "We saw his star when it rose," which means, and the people who studied this believe that it refers to a planet rising in a particular constellation. And because they were astrologers, they read these signs and understood the symbolism to mean that a newborn king of the Jews had arrived.
Right.
There's various different theories about that, which I go into in the book, all of them very interesting, but that is far a lot more likely to be the interpretation that they saw astrological signs, because astrology was virtually universal in the ancient world. Every king had his group of astrologers. Every court had their wise men and their magi. There was Egyptian forms of astrology, Greek forms of astrology, Babylonian forms of astrology, all very complicated and scientific. But this is what it meant when they said that they saw his star rising. Remember, too, they did not distinguish between a star and a planet as we do. So the astronomers think that this had to do with astrological signification.
What happened to these guys?
Well, Matthew, very mysteriously says, having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they departed to their country a different way. My theory is that their own king, Aretas IV, who knew Herod, would also have been on the alert, and they were then fugitives. Both Aretas IV and Herod were notoriously ruthless and bloodthirsty and paranoid. And so my theory is that the wise men departed to their country by a different route, and they then went up the northern road to Damascus, where Damascus had been part of Nabatean territory, but at that time was under Roman rule, so they would have been able to find safety there. But that's speculation. We don't know.
Right. Other than in the gospel specifically of Matthew, are there other nuances, innuendos, implications, references, winks of an eye towards the wise men and other parts of the New Testament?
No, not really. There is a small hint, which is very intriguing, where if they did go to Damascus, there's a few scraps of textual evidence that there were magi who were known of in Damascus. But then there were magi in most cities. So anyway, there was a hint that there were magi in Damascus. And there's a tradition that St. Paul, on his road to Damascus, was converted at a castle named Kokbar, which means star. And then there's the intriguing hint in Galatians where St. Paul says after he was converted in Damascus, he went to Arabia for 3 years. And the theologians and scholars are very unsure what this means. Why did he go to Arabia for 3 years? What did he do there? And there is one theory that he went there and he was educated and schooled by either the Magi themselves or students of the Magi who were still present in Arabia. But again, that's speculation based on just a few little hints in the gospel in the New Testament.
So here we are, 13 days away from Christmas. Our audience is going to rush out and get a copy of this. They're going to read it, and they're going to sit there and they're going to watch the play because the die has already been cast, the dress rehearsals have already started, the roles have already been. So what can pastors, church leaders, youth leaders do with the new information, new revelation, as far as this is not a profession or confession, we got it all wrong, we just now have a more enlightened understanding of the historical background. What can churches and pastors do to better educate their congregants on this account of the Magi?
I think at Christmas it's really important to try, without being harsh, to cut through some of this Christian magic and the twinkle lights and so forth. I personally feel that Satan has been very clever in fabricating this kind of marshmallow Santa Claus Christmas, which is full of fairy tales and magic. I don't want to be a party pooper or a Scrooge, but I would also say take the opportunity to say, hey, folks, let's dig in and look at the history of Jesus' birth on earth, because it's a wonderful, exciting history of real people in real places with real problems and real triumphs as they trust the Lord. And this is what makes Christmas exciting for me, to understand the reality of it all and the reality of our Lord's visit to us.
Help me, if you will, educate this non-church raised Jewish boy that grew up in a synagogue and came to faith in a synagogue. So I'm not immersed in Christology or many of the origins. Leviticus 23 gives us certain God's appointed times, everlasting observances and covenants. Jesus fulfilled as the sin offering in the millennial reign, the return of Jesus. There will be a return to the Jewish traditional appointed times prophesied by Zechariah, declared by God himself in Jerusalem. When did the celebration of Jesus, which is not a biblically mandated observation, when did the idea, and I say to people, listen, we celebrate Father's Day, it's not your father's birthday. We celebrate Mother's Day, it's not your mother's birthday. We celebrate Veterans Day, it's not the veteran's birthday. We have all these other celebrations, and certainly the birth of the Messiah would be a very significant event that is worthy of acknowledgement. As far as exact placement of the date is concerned,
we don't. The good thing is we do have actually the liturgies and the writings from the early church, and I'm not familiar exactly with the dates, but I believe as early as the 2nd century, they were beginning to celebrate the birth of Christ in December. Now, a lot of people say, oh, that's because they were just transferring over from a Roman holiday. This is not true. The fact is that the date of December 25th was determined very carefully. It was determined because in ancient Jewish times, they believed that a great man would die on the same day that he was conceived. Now, Jesus died on the date that we recognize as March 25th. Therefore, in the early church, they began to recognize March 25th as the beginning of the new year, the beginning of the world's redemption, and also the Annunciation, when the angel Gabriel came to Mary and Jesus was conceived in her womb. Now count on your 9 months from March 25th and you get December 25th. And therefore, the early date of December 25th, which is very early in the tradition, it goes back to the 2nd or 3rd century in the liturgies that we have, was determined not by a Roman celebration of some pagan feast, but by the date of Mary's Annunciation, which was March 25th. So people need to understand that. It's part of our apologetics, and it's part of the historical truth.
Excuse me. I completely agree with you, because there is so much junk out there.
Right.
And, going back to the instructions of Jeremiah not to bring a tree into your home, and all the things we've associated with Christmas.
But we'll also be interested with your Jewish background, if I can just take a moment to say that the date is also determined by the detail in the gospel when it said that Zechariah was in the temple burning incense
Yes.
when the angel came to him telling him about John the Baptist's birth. Now the scholars have worked out when, according to his heritage, on the schedule for the priest burning incense, when he would have been burning the incense. So they have the date for that,
Yes.
which means they can therefore determine John the Baptist's birthday, and all the other dates went on from there.
And I don't disagree with any of that.
And the gospel writers put
Right.
these details in so that we might know the dates.
And I have a personal vested interest in this.
Right.
Right? Because what is the date of the Epiphany?
It's January 6th is when it's celebrated.
Thank you, which is my birthday.
Ah, there you go.
So I have,
You must be a wise man then.
well, a wise guy, wise man. I think, we can put those in that caliber of, but yes, I was born in the Epiphany. So growing up in a Catholic city, Pittsburgh, I actually wound up singing with the Catholic Boys Choir under Father Donald McIlvaine.
Nice.
A fabulous, wonderful, wonderful man. My father worked retail, so he had no place to send me to do things because there were no activities. School was closed. There were no day activities, day things, because the Jewish kids went on vacation and the Christian kids had all their church activities. So what do you do with this singular young Jewish boy? Oh, you make him sing in the Catholic Boys Choir.
Sounds good.
So, I got to know a lot, but it didn't have any meaning. But the way the Lord works, of course, is that He builds things brick by brick. A single brick has no meaning until the floor is laid, until the walls are built, until the rooms are there, until the roofs are on, and all of a sudden. And actually in elementary school, Cyril Pittman, who was my gym instructor, called me. He nicknamed all of the kids. We didn't even know they were New Testament names because we were Jewish kids, but he nicknamed me Nicodemus. So that was a prophetic naming because I would come and ask the question at age 44. The very question that Nicodemus asked is,
Have you been born again?
What's that?
Have you been born again?
Right. How do you be born again? How do you inherit the kingdom of heaven? There has to be more to life than this. And I became the Nicodemus that he had talked about 38 years ago when I'm a 6-year-old tyke running around. It has been just such a pleasure to talk to you. We've been talking with Father Dwight Longenecker, author of Mystery of the Magi, the quest to identify the three wise men. Dispelling myths, filling you with facts, research. The conclusion, does it really matter? And the answer is yes, because anything that supports the Gospels, anything which validates and verifies the testimony of those who were there during the life and times of Jesus, who bore witness and can draw upon the documentation of much of it lost in the destruction of the Second Temple, but yet continue to carry on the oral traditions and the legacies and look historically at some of these events, becomes very significant as long as we find accuracy and we find validity in that accuracy. There are things that we don't examine, we take for granted, and the Bible does not tell us to do that. It says, study to show yourself approved of God. That is an ongoing process, even in something that we might consider to be in the peripheral. It is a singular event tied to a singular occasion, but the legacy and the legend is lived on in all the tellings of the birth of Jesus. Comes the telling of the Magi. Time for us to get the story right. Father Dwight Longenecker, thank you so much for sharing this story and your story and being a part of Revealing the Truth.
Thank you so much. God bless you.
Thank you. And that brings to an end our live broadcast day, but that doesn't mean we go off the air. We'll be rebroadcasting this episode and all the other prior episodes all day long. And then you can find us on the Igniting Nation YouTube channel and Revealing the Truth on WND TV. We encourage you to continue to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, and contact us if you have any questions by emailing me at information@ignitinganation.com. Until we see you back here tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock a.m. Central Time in Birmingham, Alabama, from our studios right here, live in Birmingham, we bid you shalom.